For years, one thing about China's fighter jets seemed undeniable. Their engines were weak. They overheated, wore out quickly, and forced China to rely on Russian parts just to keep aircraft flying. So when a senior GE Aerospace executive stepped onto a stage in Washington and warned that China's engines were now closing the gap, the room went silent. This was GE, the company whose engines power nearly half the aircraft in the world. The company that had always said China was decades behind. And yet suddenly, GE was no longer certain. So what did China build that made one of America's top engine makers speak publicly? To understand how we reached this moment, you need to know one thing. GE did not sound the alarm during a crisis, not after a shootdown, not after a failed test, not after leaked intelligence. This warning came during a quiet briefing at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, a place where American aerospace leaders usually speak with calm confidence. But this time, the tone was different. Steve Russell, head of GE's Advanced Projects Unit, said something no one in the West expected to hear. China's engines are still behind, but the gap is shrinking faster than anyone thought. And this didn't happen by chance. It happened because China spent 20 years attacking the one problem that kept its fighters from ever matching the United States. That problem was the engine. For decades, China could build the airframe, the avionics, even stealth designs. But the engine was always the breaking point. It overheated. It cracked. It lost power. Pilots didn't trust it, and commanders couldn't rely on it. Western analysts called it China's Achilles heel, a weakness so deep it shaped everything from range to readiness to how many jets China could keep airborne at once. But while the world dismissed China as a follower, something else was happening behind the scenes. Factories expanded. Research institutes merged. Aero engine companies were built from scratch. And, one by one, Chinese engineers began hitting milestones Western experts said were still years away. This is where the story turns. Because the engines China is now testing and deploying are not prototypes hidden in labs. They are flying on real fighters. They are powering heavy transports. They are replacing roles once filled by Russian engines China could not build itself. This is the moment GE realized the old rulebook no longer applied. And to see why, we need to look at how China went from struggling with basic engine lifespan to flying jets that forced America's top engineers to reassess the balance of power. China's first real breakthrough came with the WS-10. It didn't look like a turning point at first. When development began in the 1990s, the WS-10 struggled badly. Early units overheated. Turbine blades cracked. Engines had to be removed long before their service life ended. At first, the program seemed to confirm that China was still decades behind. Even Chinese engineers admitted the WS-10 was unreliable and far from ready to replace Russian imports. But Beijing refused to let it fail. The WS-10 became a national priority. Funding increased. New research centers opened. Foreign materials were reverse engineered down to the microscopic level. Every failure was documented, analyzed, and fed directly into the next prototype. The climb was slow, but consistent. By the mid-2010s, something changed. A refined version, the WS-10B, began appearing on J-11B fighters, then J-16s, and later the carrier-based J-15. The real milestone came with the J-10C. This was a single-engine fighter relying entirely on one power plant. When the WS-10C entered frontline service powering the J-10C, the aviation world paid attention. This was no longer an experiment. This was an engine trusted on China's most advanced domestic fighter at the time, and the signal was unmistakable. China could now mass-produce a fighter engine without Russian support. That alone marked a major shift. For years, the West assumed China would always depend on Russia for propulsion. But as more J-10Cs and J-16s rolled off the line with Chinese-built engines, that assumption collapsed. What the West once saw as a backup engine, China now viewed as a foundation. The WS-10 wasn't perfect, but it was reliable enough to build upon. And more than performance, it represented something far more important: control. China now had the ability to produce, maintain, and upgrade its fighters without waiting on anyone else. This was the moment American analysts began rethinking long-held assumptions. They expected China to field a handful of workable engines. Instead, China produced an entire fleet powered by domestic propulsion, and every year, the WS-10 quietly improved. Thrust increased, reliability edged upward. Reports from Flight Global and Janes showed Chinese pilots logging more flight hours with fewer failures. And this mattered for a simple reason. Fighter engines are not judged by raw power alone. They are judged by consistency. If an engine can deliver stable thrust, survive long missions, and be repaired quickly, it becomes a strategic asset. By the late 2010s, that is exactly what the WS-10 had become. It was no longer China's embarrassing weak link. It had become the backbone of the country's fighter fleet. But even as the WS-10 matured, China knew it had reached a ceiling. A fighter like the J-20 demanded far more: an engine capable of supercruise, extreme heat tolerance, and performance approaching the best engines built in the United States. That requirement pushed China into its next, far more ambitious challenge. And this is where the story turns again. Because the engine China built next did not simply narrow the gap. It forced GE to reconsider what the next decade of air power could look like. The WS-10 gave China its first real foothold in modern fighter propulsion. But it was the next generation of engines that changed the conversation in Washington. These engines were not designed to match aging Russian designs. They were built to challenge the propulsion systems inside America's most advanced aircraft. At the center of this shift stands the WS-15. It has been China's most ambitious engine program for nearly 3 decades. Designed for the J-20 stealth fighter, it demanded a level of engineering China had never reached before. The engine had to survive extreme temperatures, generate very high thrust, and maintain stable performance at altitudes and speeds that push materials to their limits. For years, progress was slow. Early units failed during test runs. Turbine blades drifted out of tolerance. Temperatures spiked faster than engineers could manage. Western analysts took these failures as proof that China remained far from mastering 5th-generation propulsion. Then the signs of progress began to appear. By 2023, Chinese state media and industry officials started signaling that the WS-15 had entered serial production. Short clips from test facilities showed large turbofan engines running at full power for extended cycles. And in 2024, the most important confirmation appeared overhead. High-resolution images surfaced showing J-20A prototypes fitted with engine nozzles coated in yellow primer. They did not match any Russian design. They matched the WS-15. Suddenly, this engine was no longer a paper project or an online rumor. It was flying. Reports pointed to thrust levels exceeding 36,000 pounds, possibly higher. If accurate, this would give the J-20 a performance profile far closer to the F-22 than many expected. Not equal, but closer than China had ever come before. On its own, the WS-15 would have been enough to unsettle Western analysts. But China didn't stop there. Another engine emerged, the WS-19, developed for the J-35 carrier-based stealth fighter. This aircraft is expected to operate from China's newest aircraft carriers, giving the Navy a level of reach and air defense it has never possessed. The WS-19 is smaller than the WS-15, but it is optimized for the harsh demands of carrier operations. Early assessments suggest it delivers the thrust required for catapult launches and sustained combat maneuvers at sea. At the same time, a very different engine appeared on China's largest aircraft, the WS-20. This was China's first large turbofan designed for heavy transports and tankers. For years, the Y-20 relied on Russian D-30 engines, limiting range, payload, and efficiency. The WS-20 changed that. Images and video began circulating of Y-20 transports fitted with new engines, clear evidence that China had finally produced a high-bypass turbofan on its own soil. This matters because heavy transport defines the tempo of modern warfare. These aircraft move fuel, troops, equipment, and supplies. With the WS-20, China is no longer dependent on engines designed during the Cold War. It now has the ability to project power far beyond its borders, supported by propulsion built at home. Taken together, the WS-15, WS-19, and WS-20 form something the United States did not expect to see this soon. A complete engine lineup: light fighters, heavy fighters, stealth aircraft, strategic transports, all powered by engines China developed itself. And this was the moment GE recognized the real shift. Because once a country fields multiple engines across multiple platforms, it is no longer catching up. It is shaping a future where its aircraft no longer depend on anyone else. As China's engine family took shape, another story unfolded in the background, one that honestly deepened Washington's concern. For years, American firms believed their technical edge was secure. Turbine metallurgy, cooling techniques, and digital controls were among the most closely guarded industrial secrets on Earth. They were protected not only by patents, but by experience. It takes generations of trial and error to build turbine blades that survive the heat inside modern fighters. But as China pushed forward, a pattern emerged. Technical papers, supplier contracts, and court cases revealed attempts to access Western turbine expertise. The most notable case involved a former GE engineer convicted of trying to steal trade secrets related to turbine technology. This was not speculation. It was proof of how valuable this knowledge had become. At the same time, the United States faced internal constraints of its own. Engine development slowed. Defense contracts arrived in smaller batches. Long-term investments became harder to justify. Factories sat idle between programs. Suppliers struggled to survive. The system depended on a narrow set of companies relying on predictable demand. China faced no such limits. It funded entire industrial chains with long-term planning. It built facilities years before engines were operational. It accepted risks Western firms could not afford. By late 2024, the tone in Washington shifted. Pentagon reports warned that China's air power was closing the gap faster than expected. Then GE broke its silence. A senior executive publicly acknowledged that China's engines were catching up. Not equal, not superior, but close enough to force the United States to rethink its own propulsion timelines. This was the moment the world realized the gap was no longer guaranteed. And it leads to the hardest question of all. If China continues advancing at this pace, how long before the United States loses the comfort of knowing its engines will always be better? China's new engines did more than narrow a gap. They removed the single weakness the United States relied on to remain comfortably ahead. The WS-15, WS-19, and WS-20 are not perfect, but they are no longer distant prototypes Washington expected at this stage. And that is what unsettled GE. Not that China is equal today, but that the curve is bending faster than anyone planned for. Because reliability is the final barrier. Once China pushes that metric higher, even slightly, the advantage shifts from who has the best engine to who can build the most of them. Programs deeper inside China's laboratories are moving faster than the world can see. The question now is no longer whether China catches up. It is what happens when the engine we have not seen yet finally appears, and when GE is forced to speak again.